First Days Amongst the Contrabands by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 5 School Days. The warm autumn days continued. Before Christmas the field work was done. Cotton was picked, potatoes were banked, and ground nuts gathered in. Now children and parents, even the old gray-headed people, hurried together to the schoolroom. Such a motley crowd, I venture to say, was never seen in a school before, and will not be again. All is changed. The schoolroom was filled to overflowing with eager, expectant scholars. "Us wants book larning, too, bad," they said over and over again. Some of the children had been in school before, but not one of the grown-up people could read or even knew how to handle a book. Indeed, a book was to them a mystery which they supposed would impart knowledge by some occult influence without any effort on their part. They were beginners in every sense of the word, as they expressed it. "Us ain't know nothing, and you is to larn we." Work accumulated rapidly. I wished I had 50 pairs of hands to labor with. But there was no time to waste in wishing. Afraid? I knew no such word as fear. I only thought of what might, could, would, and should be done. A sewing school seemed to be our most pressing need, so I announced that one should be started at once. But material to work on was needed, and there was none on hand. It took a very long time to get supplies from the north. We soon learned we must be patient waiters in a military department, especially when Sherman's army was passing through. In this dilemma, General Saxton came to my aid. There was some coarse, heavy contraband goods stored in the arsenal. Could I make use of it in my school? I replied we could use anything that could be cut with scissors and pierced with a needle. So he donated several pieces of dark hickory-brown twilled cotton. One of the disciples in Boston had already furnished me with a generous supply of threads, needles, thimbles, etc. With these I felt rich indeed. Twice a week the Major's wife and Mrs. Wilson drove down from headquarters in an ambulance to help me in cutting, basting, and directing, helping me to bear a load which was becoming too heavy. It was true, as they said, we could not enter the department without a teacher's commission, and we are quite ready to fulfill our contract. They nobly redeemed their promise. No sooner was one set of girls supplied with work and clothing than another gang, as they called themselves, appeared. Sewing had a great fascination for all. They learned readily and soon developed much skill and ingenuity. They had never had the free use of sewing materials before and were now delighted beyond expression. I dismissed the morning school and told the girls who wished to sew to go home for luncheon and come back in half an hour. This was the first day when sewing was inaugurated. When I returned after recess, I found the girls still on the piazza, waiting and watching for the ambulance which was to bring the ladies from town. Upon questioning them, I found they were afraid of losing their chance if they did not stand by. "Dem won't let we come back ef we go home," said one large girl apologetically. The ladies were never weary of well-doing. There was much that was interesting and also amusing in the attempts of some of the younger girls to master the intricacies of plain sewing. I see before me now those bright-eyed, demure-looking maidens as they came up, one after another, for a needleful of thread which they always received with a curtsy. Indeed, they never took anything from a teacher, whether book, paper, pens, or the simplest thing, without dropping a curtsy. But they were shy of speaking. "Can you not say thank you to the lady who has been so kind to you?" once said a gentleman to a large girl. She gave him a startled and inquiring look, then turned and made a deeper curtsy and went away. She evidently did not know what he meant. Old Fort Children. The girls of the plantation who went to a small school held in the Praise House in the Grove were much distressed to find their neighbors enjoying advantages which they had not. So one day they sent a messenger to beg me to take them into school. So I was obliged to refuse on account of my limited supplies. These children had been rather unfriendly to the refugees, always passing them with a degree of scorn, and speaking of them as "dem rice niggers." But now they were entirely ready to fraternize. One little creature smuggled herself into the school and remained a long time before I discovered she belonged to the other district. Another left home and went to stay with an auntie only half a mile away, so as to be in the limits of my district. Then one day all the girls came early and seated themselves before I arrived, determined to try a coup de main. This was on Saturday, when their own school was closed. It was impossible to take them in then, so I treated them as visitors until recess, then explained, as well as I could, my reasons for refusing to admit them, and thus sent them away. Later in the season I was enabled to unite the two schools, greatly to the satisfaction of all concerned. There must be a little bird in every bough to carry news, it flies so fast. As soon as this new decision was made, a group of these same girls appeared at the schoolroom door to escort me home. It was their custom to hop around behind me, much like a flock of blackbirds. And like these birds, too, they chattered all the time. I heard one girl say to another that she was coming to my school now. The other indignantly repudiated the idea. "Not so, gal, that's a story," she said. "Yes, us is too," said another with vehement gesticulations. "Her belongs to we now, and us belongs to she." And they marched on triumphantly. The refugees were vastly worse off than the plantation people. They literally had nothing to wear, and the weather had become very cold. Women came to me with only a skirt on, made of coarse bagging, or crocus, tied together with twine, and a nondescript garment over the shoulders, something between a shawl and a sack, made of old bits of carpeting. Girls wore soldiers' cast-off jackets and overcoats, and boys had on calico slacks. Many of the children had on but one garment, which was like a long smock frock. In this guise they all looked alike, especially as men, women, and children wore pieces of old cloth tied over their heads to keep out the cold. Grammatically speaking, gender in school was hopelessly mixed. Him and he were used indiscriminately. A woman would call her husband the old man. One man said of his wife, "The old hen, he mighty keerful." A more grotesque-looking crowd was never seen, nor a merrier one either. Their grotesqueness came from necessity. Each one had put on the thing that came first to his hand. Their merriment was partly characteristic of the race, but also a hopefulness and faith in the good time coming. It seemed but fair to help those people first who, in their flight, had left their few possessions behind them. Irregularity. Whilst the zeal of these people for learning never flagged, they had no possible conception of time or the fitness of things. Men, women, and children hurried to the schoolhouse at all hours, and at most unseasonable times, expecting to catch a lesson. Reproof was unheeded or not understood. Us had something particular to do, was the invariable excuse. Finally, I told the children to start for school as soon as they had eaten their breakfast. This had no effect. I learned in time that breakfast, as we understand it, was to them an unknown term. They ate when they were hungry. Then I said, "Come as soon as you are up." The next morning, by daylight, I heard a low chattering and suppressed laughter, and looking out of my window, I saw the piazza was filled with black heads. An eager crowd was waiting for me. Every morning after that, the whole gang came to escort me to school. Usually one bolder than the rest would come to the door and announce, "Us waiting on you, ma'am." I soon began to feel that it was I who was under supervision and kept up to my duty, and not my poor neighbors. In order to establish regularity and to push things on, we had sewing school every Saturday. Most of the boys felt aggrieved. They begged to be allowed to sew too. "'Tain't fair," we heard them say. "Dem gals has all de tings." So in time, when our stock of goods increased, we had a class of boys in sewing, some of whom did most creditable work. I use the word "we" with great satisfaction, for my military friends stood by me all winter, lending a helping hand when and where they could. Without their aid, I should have been working alone. Many days I never saw a white face from morning until dark. Literally, I paddled my own canoe, as the Negroes say. In time, some of the most industrious girls finished their new dresses, stitching, overcasting, buttons, and buttonholes, ready to carry home and to wear to Sunday school the next day. This was indeed a great occasion. The delight of the possessors was inexpressible, while the admiration of the beholders was very manifest. To our surprise, no matter how destitute were those less fortunate, they showed neither envy nor jealousy. The delight of one was shared by all. The entire school was nearly upset and demoralized when 13 new dresses were finished and folded ready to be carried home. The children suppressed their mirth as best they could until they got out of doors. Then their pent-up spirits burst forth. Such shouts and guffaws as they gave! They knocked each other in the ribs, rolled over and turned somersaults, and did all sorts of funny things. We laughed heartily in sympathy as we sat down on the piazza and drew a long breath of relief after a very hard day's work. Northern Friends. During this time, my northern friends, individually and collectively, were doing their utmost to help on the work amongst the freedmen. The Freedmen's Aid Society of Boston was constantly forwarding supplies to the different posts where schools were established. But in our unsettled condition, it was extremely difficult to get hold of the things intended for and sent to us. Innumerable boxes and bundles, big and little, went astray. How many hours and days of patient watching and waiting we have spent looking for the things we knew had been sent, but never came. The best gift of all was Miss Fanny, who was forwarded to me just after New Year's, ostensibly to be my assistant. But I halt at the word, for she was everything to me and to the poor people around me. Young, active, and enthusiastic, fresh from school, with all the new methods of study and teaching, she inspired an admiration and enthusiasm which fell little short of hero worship. I say she was sent, for those were the days of red tape and military discipline. No one could enter this field of labor without a certain selection and ordination. My pastor, Mr. James Freeman Clark of the Church of Disciples, Boston, had already written, "When you need an assistant, we are ready to adopt her and help her to get to you." The time had come, and Miss Fanny was started, but was stopped in New York and told that no female could be allowed to cross the military lines for any cause whatever, no matter how urgent was the call. This was an irrevocable order. A great many officers' wives wishing to join their husbands were waiting around the Transportation Bureau for the necessary papers or permits. Some of the officers in power were extremely rough and even brutal in their refusals. One lady drove to the office and demanded a passport, but was unceremoniously refused. "You don't know who I am?" she said angrily. "I am Mrs. General," mentioning the name of a superior officer. "I don't care if you are Mrs. Jesus Christ. You should not go," was the rough and profane answer. I mention this only to show the spirit of the times. Not long after this, these restrictions were removed, and teachers and nurses were granted permits to enter the department as before. So Miss Fanny came in due time. She stopped first at headquarters, and was then sent in an ambulance down to me. The first I saw of her, she was standing in the schoolroom door, radiant with delight. The children began to buzz, so I gave an extra recess, but they only gathered around the door on the piazza and gazed at us. "Who da him?" I heard them say. "Him's Miss Fanny," said one girl with superior knowledge, having heard me speak the name. "Oh, but him's prime," they declared. Christmas came on Sunday, and was a day long to be remembered. I had wished to give the day scholars some Christmas gifts, but my supply was very small. I had, indeed, only a box of thread, needles, and small wares given me by one of the disciples, whose forethought I should have regarded as almost inspiration, did I not know her kindly deeds were perpetually overflowing. These were my gifts, and nothing could have been more acceptable. To each girl a needle, to each woman a needle and a hank of thread, and to the men and boys picture papers. But the boys begged for one needle too, which I gave, to their infinite delight. They wanted their needles threaded with white cotton, Then they stuck them on the side of their coats or jackets or shirts, and wound the thread round and round securely. A few of the boys gave their needles to their mothers, but most of them wore them as ornaments for months. Since then, through the generous kindness of Northern friends, we have had many festivals and valuable and useful gifts for the freed people. But nothing has ever been received with more manifest gratitude and delight than the first Christmas present of one needle. Christmas night. We invited all the people in our neighborhood to have praise meetings Sunday night in the schoolhouse. We wished to make this occasion for us all that they would call a Jubilee. So we dressed the house with a profusion of evergreens and gray moss, and illuminated it with many rows of candles. Over 200 black people assembled before dark, and the house was absolutely packed. Long before we reached the place, we could see the bright lights, which cast a glow over the trees and far out upon the water. We could also hear their shouting songs, with the clapping of hands and stamping of feet. I fancied that in the rhythm I could follow the lines of Whittier's Song of the Negro Boatmen. "Oh, praise and thanks de Lord he come to set de people free, and Massa tinket dey ob doom, and we ob Jubilee. De Lord dat heap de Red Sea waves, he just as strong as den. He say de word, we last night slaves, today de Lord's freemen. De yam will grow, de cotton blow, we'll hab de rice and corn. Oh, nebber you fear, if nebber you hear de driver blow his horn. We pray de Lord he gib us signs, dat someday we be free. De north wind tell it to de pines, de wild duck to de sea. We tink it when de church bell ring, we dream it in de dream. De rice bird mean it when he sing, de eagle when he scream. De yam will grow, de cotton blow, we'll hab de rice and corn. Oh, nebber you fear, if nebber you hear de driver blow his horn. We know de promise nebber fail, and nebber lie de word. So like de 'postles in de jail, we waited for de Lord. And now he open every door, and throw away de key. He tink we lub him so before, we lub him better free. De yam will grow, de cotton blow, he'll gib de rice and corn. Oh, nebber you fear, if nebber you hear de driver blow his horn. As we neared the house, we congratulated ourselves upon its brilliant appearance. But when we entered the room, the lights seemed to have gone out. The darkness was so dense, and the shadows so deep. All the light was absorbed by the mass of black faces. I told the church leaders to go on with the services as if we were not present. Thereupon one of the elders adjusted a huge pair of spectacles and took up a book, which he pretended to read. He chose the 1978 hymn, and proceeded to line off. "Why do we mourn, departed friends?" which we thought very appropriate under the circumstances. Then the whole congregation sang with tremendous force, drawling the words. One of the members made a long prayer which was wonderfully intoned. Then the leader asked me to preach to them. I replied there was but one sermon fitting this occasion, and I read the whole of Christ's Sermon on the Mount, first explaining to them the meaning of the evergreens and wreaths, the cross and illuminations, typical of Christ's life and teachings. They gave breathless attention to all this, ejaculating from time to time, "My Lord, is that so?" I know now they understood very little of all I said, but no speaker ever had more interested and attentive listeners. When I sat down, one of the leaders chanted rather than spoke a touching prayer, in which he styled me his dear imperial preacher. Then the white friends sang, "Joy to the world, the Lord has come," upon which Father Major got up and made a low bow, saying, "Dem sing just like the mockingbirds." By this time the entire audience was aroused and ready to pray and sing all night. In each prayer the speaker tried to introduce, in his uncouth phraseology, some of the passages of Scripture he had heard read. At the close, each one of this great crowd came to shake hands, thanking us for the good time they had had. The next morning several women called to thank me for my beautiful preachment. Emancipation Celebration. The Contrabands had a great emancipation celebration in Beaufort on New Year's, at which General Saxton and all his officers were present. As we stood on the steps of the library building and looked upon the crowd below, it seemed like a great sea of black heads. Some of our friends estimated there were 5,000 contrabands present. General Saxton, Father Hunn, Mr. Judge, as they called the general superintendent, Mr. Tomlinson, Parson French, and many others made stirring speeches. There must have been some in this crowd who understood what was said. The mass did not. But all knew they were admonished to do their best. Many were the exclamations, "That's so, massa. You is right. We'll do so, sure." A good-looking negress, dressed as the goddess of liberty, sang in that New Jerusalem, which is the Marseillaise of the slaves. As she waved her banner, the entire crowd took up the chorus with a shout. "In that New Jerusalem I am not afraid to die. We must fight for liberty in that New Jerusalem." The effect was electrical. This was not the first time the freed people had come together to celebrate their emancipation, but it was a new era to a large majority. At this time there were but few, if any, who had faith in their freedom, or who understood what it meant. The new people who were constantly coming into the lines were just awakening to the fact that they were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 2 years before this, there was a great emancipation celebration in the old Fort Grove, where the slaves were told for the first time that they were free. It was most fitting that such a jubilee should be held in this, one of the grandest of God's first temples. The words of the poet Mr. Judd reverberated through its arches. "This day is the birth time of millions. The dawn of the year 63 will be marked on the dial of ages, the hour when a race became free." As if from a sky gray and clouded, and hung with deep gloom like a pall, the mists were rolled back, and the sunlight streamed glad rays of splendor o'er all. What though in the list of the nations we long have been proudly enrolled, and the stars and the stripes of our banners have floated defiant and bold? What though with unequaled devotion our fathers imperiled their lives, securing the guerdon of freedom forever to children and wives? If yet on the air of each morning the wail of the downtrodden rise, and victims of tyranny holden still vainly solicit the skies, if yet in the valleys, on mountains made sacred by liberty's fires, oppression still rivets its fetter, and sons are still slaves like their sires. But hark! From the people's tribunal a voice sends its echoes afar, sweet echoes, and nuditudes hear them above all the din of the war. For justice aroused from long slumbers goes forth, and a glad jubilee is his herald most welcome, proclaiming, "The set time has come, ye are free." Let us shout, "We are free," till these islands resound with the jubilant strain, and catching it up, the enfranchised shall thunder it west o'er the main. Shall thunder it o'er the savannas, and down the broad streams, till the sea rolls back like a giant anthem chorus, the shout, "We are free, we are free." And shout they did, again and again, and then sang, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty," with a force that might have moved mountains. For the first time a race could say, "My country, land of liberty." The Nigger's Heaven. For a long time Beaufort had been called the Nigger's Heaven and the Black Country, names which have clung to it ever since. Contrabands were coming into the Union lines and thence to the town, not only daily, but hourly. They came alone and in families and in gangs, slaves who had been hiding away and were only now able to reach safety. Different members of scattered families following after freedom, as surely and safely guided as were the wise men by the Star of the East. On New Year's Day, I walked around amongst these people with Major Saxton. We went to their tents and other quarters. 150 poor refugees from Georgia had been quartered all day on the wharf. A wretched and most pitiable gang, miserable beyond description. But when we spoke to them, they invariably gave a cheerful answer. Usually to our question, "How do you do?" the response would be, "Thank God, I live." Sometimes they would say, "Us ain't no worser than us been." These people had been a long time without food, excepting a little hominy and uncooked rice and a few ground nuts. Many were entirely naked when they started, and all were most scantily clothed, and we had already had some extremely cold days, which we, who were fresh from the north, found hard to bear. It was the same old story. These poor creatures were covered only with blankets, or bits of old carpeting, or pieces of bagging, crocus, fastened with thorns or sharp sticks. Negroes on the March. General H. W. Slocum, Major General commanding Left Wing Army of Georgia, reported, "Negro men, women, and children joined the columns at every mile of our march, many of them bringing horses and mules, which they cheerfully turned over to the quartermaster's department. I think at least 14,000 of these people joined the two columns at different points on the march, but many of them were too old and infirm, and others too young, to endure the fatigue of the march, and were left in the rear. More than one half of this number, however, reached the coast with us. Many of the able-bodied men were transferred to the officers' and subsistence department, and others were employed in the corps as teamsters, cooks, and servants. Brigadier A.S. Williams also reported, "Negroes of all ages and every variety of physical condition, from the infant in its mother's arms to the decrepit old man, joined the column. From plantation and from crossroads, singly and in large groups, on foot, on horseback, and in every description of vehicle. The vehicles were discarded as obstructing the progress of our very long column. Beyond this, no effort was made to drive away the fugitives. The decrepit, the aged, and the feeble were told of the long journey before them and advised to remain behind. I estimate that from 6,000 to 8,000 slaves at different points in the campaign joined the march of this corps, of whom something over 2,500 reached our camp before Savannah. About 1,700, of whom one-third were able-bodied, were, on account of scarcity of subsistence, placed in colony at the Colerain plantation on the Savannah River, and plentifully supplied with rice and occasionally with beef. The able-bodied men were employed in transporting rice from the islands and in working rice mills. 400 to 500, not of the colony, found employment as officers' servants and teamsters for the government. Many of those left in the rear had straggled along until they reached Beaufort. Some had come by short journeys from plantation to plantation, crossing from the mainland to the island in old rotten dugouts. There was a steady stream of stragglers pouring into town day and night. Superintendents had their hands more than full in finding places for and issuing rations to these poor refugees. Those sent to plantations were allowed a piece of ground for garden in which to raise corn, potatoes, and groundnuts. Only the most helpless were quartered out. The old people and women whose husbands were in the colored regiments, and the young children. Families were scattered around, and at first many of the women found themselves amongst strangers. This was a sore trial. They are social and gregarious creatures, and cannot endure to be alone. In old times, all plantation changes and business arrangements were made at New Year's. So now these scattered people determined to get back to Massa's niggas by some means or other, and great was the moving about. The superintendents were full of care, and at their wits' end to know what to do. Our plantation, Smith's, or Old Fort, was a favorite resort, partly because it was easy of access, and partly on account of the refugee village on Montgomery Hill. After New Year's we often found two families in one house where there was but one before. Our superintendent was known to be kind and straightforward with these people, and they were delighted to work for him. "Tell him us'll give our eyes for him," said an old man to me. That was Chapter 5, School Days, from First Days Amongst the Contrabands, by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett.